These corrupt local government councillors have decided that you should become vegan to save the climate, and they came to this conclusion as they feasted on a steak dinner which was paid for by the citizens. They were dobbed in by one of their own councillors who refused to attend the taxpayer-funded meal.
One of Melbourne's most controversial councils is pushing ratepayers to change the way they eat and spend money to meet its ambitious climate targets. Becoming vegetarian is among a number of Yarra City Council's recommendations.
The disconnect between elite bureaucrats and the average man in the street is not unique to Australia. I know that you folks in North America and the UK are going through exactly the same at the moment. But this example comes from my local council here in Melbourne, the Yarra City Council, who are led by the Mayor, Edward Crossland, who's pictured here enjoying taking a sausage down his throat, and the CEO, Sue Wilkinson, who would never touch a salad without adding a block of cheese and pouring a bottle of dressing all over it. Under the leadership of these two incompetent fools, the council keeps increasing its staffing numbers every year at a rate way beyond that of the population increase. They managed to squander $230 million a year, not on core services, but on vanity projects, such as workshopping documents like the Staff Code of Conduct, which none of them choose to follow, deciding on which sexual preference flag should next fly above the town hall, hosting endless LGBTQI+ parties, rainbow crosswalks, yay! Cancelling Australia Day and removing the Australian flag from the building, repeating buzzwords like fair and equitable, and they make sure that every piece of correspondence they send out has a cheap and empty statement about Wurundjeri country on it. Then they claim not to have enough money to carry out core services like waste collection, so they find legal loopholes that allow them to charge the ratepayers more, which I've covered in a previous video. And now they have this 81-page climate emergency plan in which they repeatedly push their objective for citizens to switch to a plant-based diet. Yes, they may dine on the finest steak, but you should eat plants in order to save the climate, which they're so concerned about. Now, I've gone through the document so that you don't have to. It's 81 pages of paper shuffler crap, and I wonder just how many staff got paid to contribute to this. How many lunches, coffees, workshops, chit-chats, one-on-ones, stand-ups, review meetings, tabletop talks, circle backs. It reads like a half-arsed high school project where everyone dossed around until the last day and then at the last minute you just had to make stuff up to get it submitted. I'll give you the highlights, and keep in mind this is what so many of their staff get paid to contribute to. Immediately after the contents page, they get in there with the acknowledgement of country, because of course they have to appeal to emotion from the beginning. Hey, bad things happened in the past and we need to highlight those bad things so you won't be critical of how we squander your money. For the non-Aussies, acknowledgement of country is how smug, well-off white people condescendingly pretend to care about Aboriginal people. It's how the champagne socialists offset their wealth guilt, a bit like when climate activists fly all over the world but then point out they paid the $10 offset tax, so that makes them carbon neutral. They make this acknowledgement before any meeting, they have it written at the bottom of every email they send out, they have it at the start of every document that they write, because this is obviously going to fix any historical wrongs, isn't it? They're living in this fantasy that everything in Australia prior to Captain Cook arriving was a well-ordered, law-abiding, functional society. Basically in line with the semi-fictional writings of Bruce Pascoe, who claims that Aboriginals were extensive farmers and lived in sophisticated houses. They're unwilling to acknowledge that anything at all positive might have come from the white man. And those who benefit mostly from all this are the Aboriginal activists, often who aren't actual Aboriginals, or at most are Aboriginals who are so diluted down that they would pass as a white person in the street. The pandering continues throughout the document, mentioning anything Aboriginal related, dropping in Aboriginal words as often as possible. For over 60,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have cared for country across this continent. Due to the effects of colonisation, the dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this continent, and of First Nations peoples around the world, a worldview of interdependence of all life was replaced by a worldview that separates humans from nature. Interdependence of all life? Didn't the Australian Aboriginals wipe out the local pygmy population? I guess that's an inconvenient truth for Eddie Crossland. No, Tom, that was all debunked. Yeah, it was conveniently debunked by progressive activists. The land that Yara occupies is a small portion of the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people. Around the country, traditional owner knowledge and practices are being adopted to inform and improve land management and promote sustainability. Do you know who didn't exist on a plant-based diet? Which group of people were not vegan? If we're going to follow the practices of our indigenous brothers and sisters, then start getting tucked into some endangered turtles. They keep mentioning NARM, which is the fashionable new name for Melbourne that the progressives are pushing. A name nobody had heard of 5 years ago, but now they all pretend they've been using it their entire lives. What are you talking about, Tom? I've always called it NARM. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania was always at war with East Asia. They can't even decide on the spelling of NARM. This official document from the council spells NARM with a double AR 5 times, but ARR 4 times. The latter spelling occurring in pages 18 and 19. Obviously, staff members who contribute to different parts of the plan get to choose their own spelling. Actually, it doesn't matter how you spell it as long as it sounds exotic. All up, words like Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Wurundjeri, First Nations, First People, NARM, and Indigenous appear over 80 times in this climate emergency plan. And I haven't bothered to count all the unique Aboriginal words that they sprinkle in there for cosmetic purposes. So is this a climate emergency plan or an exercise in emotional manipulation, making genuine Aboriginal people feel like victims and guilt-tripping whitey into submission? Did you know that there are 512 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in Yarra, and that these people are disproportionately affected by climate impacts? So only about 0.5% of the population of this area are Aboriginal, and this is what the focus of the climate emergency plan is? And even that 0.5% I think is a little bit generous. I suspect it's less than that with how fashionable it's become to claim to be Aboriginal. But it's not just Aboriginals who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. They also take the time to lecture us on how climate change is worse for refugees, asylum seekers, the homeless, social housing residents, the disabled, older adults, children, young people, at-risk workers. And they provide a table of examples which oddly includes a person of colour who can't find fish. Obviously just a cringe statement they made up based on their racist view of a black person. The poor black man can't find no fishes in the city. Basically, anyone who's not a straight white male is going to be severely impacted by the changing weather. Next, they treat us to a 2-page story about Bunjil, the wedge-tailed eagle who was the headman of the Kulin. Then we get another story about 2 boys climbing a tree and the creation of the river as they continue to use Aboriginal folklore to emotionally manipulate the population. Don't get me wrong, mythological stories do have a place, just not in guiding the spending of $230 million a year of our hard-earned cash by these dunderheads. Next in the climate emergency plan, we get a story from Uncle Ian Hunter, who apparently read this propaganda to school kids. Uncle Ian, who not many people know, is a distant cousin of Dire Straits frontman Mark Knopfler. Despite the devastating impacts of colonisation, Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have survived. They've survived. There's a lot of pushing fear and end-of-the-world scenarios throughout this document. We are in a climate emergency. As the impacts of the climate emergency accelerate, natural ecosystems are being driven towards collapse. As the climate crisis accelerates, as climate impacts accelerates, you can see there's a lot of repetition here. We are on the precipice of climate and ecological collapse. We must create homes, public infrastructure, and public spaces that are safe and comfortable in a climate-ravaged future. By repeating these lines enough, they've made them fact. And this really does impact the community, especially the young.
I'm terrified because I know I'm going to die from climate change.
That clip of a young girl saying she knows she's going to die from climate change is the fault of ideologues like those at Yarra City Council. The council constantly push this. It gets very dark when you see the lengths they go to indoctrinate and frighten your children. You'll find plenty of videos and webinars run by them that are pushing this fear, some specifically aimed at how to ram climate fear into the heads of toddlers, featuring this collection of demented climate warriors. And then there are other webinars that are aimed specifically at teenagers. No wonder young kids are losing their minds. It's even mentioned in this plan. 2/3 of young Australians report that climate concerns are having a negative impact on their mental health. It's these people who are to blame for all of this new anxiety that kids are feeling. And they excitedly highlight that the first Yarra school strike for climate was in 2019, obviously very proud of their results of their indoctrination efforts, developing a future generation of brainwashed activists, ripe for the picking by the Green Party and the globalists to do their bidding. And as I look deeper through their YouTube videos, I get into the rabbit hole of wondering how much money they've spent on all of these. Choosing a plant-based diet with Shannon Martinez, 32 views. Choosing a plant-based diet webinar, 138 views. Native plant-based cook-along with Nornie Barrow, 69 views. One of the most bemusing things about the document are the frequent sections where council staff have been allowed to write actual fiction. No, I'm not joking. They have many short stories of their vision of a future Yarra utopia scattered throughout the climate emergency plan. The best one being where they jump to 2030 and let their imaginations run wild with all sorts of fantasy scenarios where they fully display their narcissism and pat themselves on the back for saving the planet. It's 2030. They told us it was impossible, but together we did it. With unprecedented collaboration and commitment across all levels of government, business and the community, we transformed our community and our environment. Collectively, we mobilised to demand a rapid shift to zero emissions and a circular economy. At this rate, it's looking like we will achieve our net zero by 2035 target by the 2035 target ahead of schedule. Nobody read over this official document from the council to give it a final edit. You have these minor errors all over it. They've just mashed it all together from different people that contributed to it. $230 million a year. And I'm not a perfectionist. I can be forgiving of typos and inconsistent formatting, but I expect a little bit more from my $230 million. Our food choices have become more considered too, and we eat more and more plant-based food. This is where they're all sucking themselves off. Council played a leadership role in many of these transitions, forming partnerships across the community and with other local governments. The first step towards this future was taking the time to imagine the transformations that needed to happen, and they all lived happily ever after. Infantilized stories for infantilized, highly paid public servants. All of them living in a fantasy land and pissing $230 million a year up the wall. There's even more stories in this climate emergency plan, which I'll treat you to a reading of in a future video. Now, the council team behind all of this have to justify their salaries, including Sue's salary of $420,000 a year. And they do this by inventing a whole load of metrics that will be used, but it's all stuff that can be easily manipulated. There will be inconsistencies when they're collecting the data. They will gather information selectively. There will be errors and inconsistency at the point of the data entry. Department managers who have to produce stats to contribute to the overall plan will just pull it out of their arse to get the response back to the data collector. Then at the end of it all, the data analysts can present the data selectively to tell the desired story. You know, lies, damned lies, and statistics. I've worked in these council environments where I've pointed out the flaws in their data with the intention to improve things, and it does not go down well with them. Now, if you can't be bothered making all their suggested changes to your life in order to save the climate, then don't worry, because they've got a much easier way to avoid climate catastrophe. All you have to do is listen to their climate action playlist. Yay! This council is just a daycare centre for some of them, and it's a paid activist gig for others. They're wasting your money on these vanity projects. busy work type activities which make them feel warm and fuzzy inside. We'd be much better off cutting all of their salaries in half and sticking them in a room with a colouring book and a box of crayons. Stay tuned for more.